One of the biggest industrial companies in Florida tried to build an ethanol plant next to a historic seaport town called Fernandina Beach. Was a project that had locals up in arms because, among other things, ethanol plants have a tendency to explode. The city of Fernandina Beach ended up denying this project. And so this industrial giant went running to the Florida legislature to try and get the law changed. We're going to tell you more about what exactly went down and the games they played on this in just a sec. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. The name Seeking Rents comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So today we've got a real David versus Goliath story in which Republicans in the Florida legislature sure did their damnedest to help Goliath. This is going to be the latest story to come out of some public records we mentioned that we obtained from the Florida legislature after this year's legislative session. We've already done a couple of episodes on stories to come out of this, including one about a Republican mega donor and beef jerky magnate who got the legislature to change the law after animal rights activists caught him hosting a mass pigeon shoot on a secluded piece of property he owns in a rural part of the state. And then we had another episode about the state's largest private landowner, the Mormon Church, trying to undo development rules on rural land, which would have had the effect of making it even easier for the church to build essentially a new city on hundreds of thousands of acres of cattle ranch lands it owns east of Orlando. I'll put a link to both of those shows into the show notes if you missed them. Before we get into today's show, though, just a quick reminder, as always, please click like and subscribe. That helps us grow the audience and spread the word about the show. If the fancy strikes you, maybe leave a comment or review. That's really helpful, too. And if you haven't already, please consider signing up for a subscription to the newsletter. Easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com, which will redirect you to the Substack link. A subscription will have all of our newsletters and podcasts sent straight to your inbox. Everything is free. None of our content is behind a paywall. There is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you've got the means. Please think about doing that if you can. The revenue we get from those voluntary paid subscriptions help pay for things like the public records requests that lead to stories like these. So, okay, with that out of the way, we're going to start today's story in Fernandina Beach, which is honestly I think it's my favorite place in Florida. If you've never been there, Fernandina Beach, it's on Amelia Island. This is the northernmost place on the Atlantic coast in Florida. It's a turn of the century seaport town. It's right where the Amelia and St. Mary's rivers meet and spill out into the Atlantic Ocean. There's tons of gorgeous Victorian architecture, Victorian homes. It's got what claims to be the oldest saloon or the oldest bar in Florida. There's some great beaches. There's a Civil War era fort out there. It's also apparently the birthplace of the modern shrimping industry. I'm not entirely sure what the modern shrimping industry means, but I do know I've had some pretty amazing shrimp in Fernandina Beach before. Fernandina Beach is also a bit of a company town. It's in Nassau County, which is also the home to the headquarters of Rayonier, one of the world's largest timber companies, and incidentally, the number 3 private landowner in Florida. If you're curious, number 1 is, as we talked about in the last show, the Mormon Church through its company Farmland Reserve. Number 2 is billionaire Thomas Petterfee, who essentially owns almost all of Florida's Big Bend. He a couple of years ago he bought a company. He bought a timber company that was known as Foley Land and Timber, and he now runs it through a company that he's named Four Rivers. I think Timber and Land. Four Rivers Land and Timber. Four Rivers Timber and Land. One of the two. Anyway, back in the 1930s, Rayonier built a big pulp mill right next to downtown Fernandina Beach that At one point, its workforce was the equivalent of like one fifth of the city's population. That mill is still in business today, although it is now owned by technically by a separate company called Rayonier Advanced Materials, which goes by the acronym RYAM or RYAM. RYAM was created when Rayonier, the timber company, decided to essentially split off its manufacturing division from its forestry and real estate divisions and create a standalone company. That company, RYAM, is worth something like $330 million today. And it still has the mill in operation where it's still one of the biggest employers in that region. It's got something like 314 employees at last check. In 2023, RYAM unveiled plans to build an ethanol plant next to its pulp mill in Fernandina Beach. This was going to be a bioethanol plant, is what the company called it, because it was going to take essentially industrial waste that was generated when it at the pulp mill, industrial waste generated when RYAM converts wood chips into cellulose pulp. And it was going to take that waste and turn it into bioethanol, ethanol that could be used as, a fuel additive. It could be used in food coloring solvents, that sort of thing. This plant was going to produce something like 7.5 million gallons of ethanol a year, capable of producing that much. And RYAM said it was going to invest something like $53 million into this project. But this plan set off an enormous local controversy. Residents in Fernandina Beach were up in arms and just intensely opposed to the idea of building an ethanol plant right next to their historic downtown. Craig Pittman, the legendary environmental journalist in Florida, wrote this fantastic story about this stuff last year as this controversy was unfolding, where he noted that part of the concern was that ethanol plants have a tendency, have what he said, quote, a tendency to blow up. In fact, Craig found in his research that something like that there had been ethanol plants explosions in 6 states in just the past 2 years. And voters were so opposed, they were so up in arms about this idea that they actually threw their mayor out of office. This mayor was a guy who worked for RYAM and was supportive of this ethanol plant project. And voters instead replaced him with someone who was opposed to the plant. So it probably won't surprise you to learn that after all that, city leaders decided to deny RYAM's application to build this ethanol plant. And specifically, the way they did this is there was kind of a technicality where they said this ethanol plant would amount to chemical manufacturing or chemical refining. And chemical manufacturing and chemical refining were explicitly prohibited under the city's land use plan and land development code. So and by state law, they're bound to enforce these things strictly. So they said they could not approve the project because it was the equivalent of chemical manufacturing or chemical refining, and that was not allowed under its land development rules. This was obviously a big victory for locals who spent, again, more than a year rallying opposition to this thing. But of course, as you can probably guess by the fact that I'm talking about it, that was not the end of things. So the city formally rejected RYAM's ethanol plant on February 4th of this year. 3 weeks later, RYAM sued the city in state court. And the suit essentially asks a judge to overturn the denial. It is built on seeking a ruling from the judge to say that the city was incorrect to say that this ethanol plant was chemical manufacturing or chemical refining, that it does not count as that, it should not qualify as that sort of stuff, and therefore should be allowed under the city's comp plan and land development code. But that wasn't all. A few weeks later, and about 200 miles away in Tallahassee, a new measure suddenly surfaced in the Florida legislature. This was buried deep inside a late amendment to Senate Bill 1118, Senate Bill 1118. This was legislation we talked about last week. It's just this sweeping bill that was just stuffed with favors for various special interests. I mean, this was like a real sort of rent-seeking buffet of a bill. The sponsor was a guy by the name of Stan McClain, a Republican state senator from Ocala. And this ethanol stuff was basically two sentences tucked deep inside a 40-page amendment. And basically, these two sentences did the exact same thing the lawsuit was trying to do. It would have changed state law to make clear that the production of ethanol from wood chips, like RYAM was proposing to do in Fernandina Beach, did not constitute chemical refining or chemical manufacturing. What's more, it made that change retroactive to apply to any previous, quote, interpretations to the contrary. So essentially, this legislation itself would have also undone the city of Fernandina Beach's denial and allowed RYAM to move forward with this ethanol plant. Those two sentences, it turns out, came from RYAM itself. And here's how we know that. So in one of the public records requests we submitted to the legislature after session ended, we got back an email in which Stan McLean's office sent a lobbyist who's working on a different part of Senate Bill 1118 a bunch of amendments that McLean was planning to add to Senate Bill 1118. One of the files in that email was called, quote, bioethanol amendment. It was a Word doc with bioethanol amendment, and it had the exact language that would later get filed and added to this bill. And the metadata on that document shows that the two authors were a pair of RYAM lobbyists. It actually gets better, or it gets worse, depending on your perspective here. Those two RYAM lobbyists work at a firm called Lewis, Longman and Walker. They're lawyers at this firm. Lewis, Longman and Walker is the same law firm representing RYAM in its lawsuit against the city of Fernandina Beach. In fact, the metadata on this file shows it was created the same week that RYAM sued the city. So basically what you have is RYAM had its lawyers suing the city of Fernandina Beach while simultaneously trying to rewrite state law to guarantee that it would win that lawsuit. Now, I know it seems kind of obvious here. I mean, of course this legislation came from RYAM. I mean, who else would even care about this? But it is important to get this kind of thing on the record and documented, because here's the thing about at least some people in the Florida legislature. They will lie, especially when they're trying to do a favor for some special interest that they know voters might find revolting. So I'm going to play you a clip now from a hearing on Senate Bill 1118 during this past session. And this is the hearing where this amendment with the RYAM ethanol language went onto the bill. And just before that happened, a state senator by the name of Chevron Jones, a Democrat from Miami Gardens, asks Stan McLean a question about this language. And so we're going to play it now.
So I received about 150 calls on this piece of legislation so far, and I know I've received some calls from some individuals who live in Fernandina Beach and individuals who live in Amelia Island, and heard from both sides, Republicans and Democrats, who have expressed their opposition to the potential of their fear of ethanol plants being built next to private homes, based off of how we are redefining Statute 581.011. Are we not concerned? Are we not taking into consideration those concerns from those individuals? I guess what I'm trying to ask.
You're recognized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know the particulars of that particular process or project and where it's located. I think what we wanted to do was to be able to define ethanol production and how it takes place and how it can take place.
I don't know the particulars of that project, he said. Now, I suppose technically it's possible that Stan McLean wasn't lying here. I mean, maybe he really didn't know what RYAM was trying to do. Maybe he just took the language they gave him and agreed to add it to his bill without asking any questions whatsoever. Maybe he was intentionally ignorant about this and also incredibly irresponsible. But I kind of doubt it. Either way, it did not work. Senate Bill 1118 eventually stalled out and did not pass. Not just because of this, although clearly this played a role. Again, there was a lot of unpopular stuff that had people up in arms about this. At one point, the local Republican Party in Marion County, where Stan McLean lives, came out against this bill. That's how sort of ugly Senate Bill 1118 was at one point. Now, RYAM kept trying, just to be clear here. This same language actually later surfaced much later in session, very close to the end in the House, in a piece of legislation called House Bill 579, which was sponsored by a Republican state representative by the name of Toby Overdorf, who is from the Stewart area down on kind of the Treasure Coast. But House Bill 579 failed to pass too. It is probably a credit to all the on-the-ground organizing and activism by the folks in Fernandina Beach who had been fighting this ethanol plant, like I said, for more than a year at this point. Remember the 150 calls that Chev Jones said he got about this. Although I should probably also mention here that the The activists opposing this, who had a group called No Ethanol Fernandina, did manage to scrounge the money together to hire Ballard Partners to help to lobby against this in Tallahassee. Ballard Partners is pretty much the biggest, baddest lobbying firm in Florida. It is run by this just gargantuan Republican Party fundraiser. It has, deep ties to both the Trump and the DeSantis administration. I still maintain that this was a David versus Goliath story, although I suppose maybe it was one in which David temporarily managed to swap out his slingshot for a grenade launcher. But anyway, there's also an especially delicious irony here as well, by the way. And in its lawsuit against the city of Fernandina Beach, Ryan's lawyers make a big point of noting that one city commissioner in Fernandina Beach apparently worked behind the scenes on a plan to change the city's comp plan to explicitly prohibit bioethanol. So again, the denial at Fernandina Beach rested on the idea that bioethanol production, was a form of chemical manufacturing or chemical refining, and chemical manufacturing and chemical refining were not allowed. This is what Ryan is disputing in its lawsuit, that it should not be considered chemical manufacturing or refining. And Ryan in its lawsuit argues that the fact that one of the city commissioners tried to change the comp plan to explicitly outlaw bioethanol made it, quote, is an acknowledgement that the existing policy did not in fact prohibit the production of ethanol. In other words, Ryan is saying the city knew that its comp plan didn't actually prohibit its ethanol plant. And you can tell that because they tried to change their comp plan, or they secretly worked on a plan to potentially change their comp plan to outlaw it. Except, of course, you can now flip that exact same argument around and use it against Ryan. Ryan just worked behind the scenes in the Florida legislature on a plan to change the law to explicitly allow its bioethanol plant. By that very same logic, Ryan is now acknowledging here that its plant is not allowed under current law. That's why it had to change the law. Who knows? Maybe this will come up in that lawsuit. Because as you can probably guess, this is still not over. That state lawsuit is now, at last check, scheduled to go to trial on August 28th. So a little later this month. They're thinking it's going to be a 10-day trial if it goes forward as scheduled. But Ryan is also trying to find new ways to pressure the city of Fernandina Beach over this. So it has, for instance, filed a separate lawsuit, a federal lawsuit against the city that claims the city violated the company's constitutional rights to due process. So corporations are people too, strikes again. And perhaps more significantly, just last month, Ryan notified Fernandina Beach leaders that it may try to squeeze nearly $7 million in compensation out of the city for denying this ethanol plant. It would do so under Florida's Burt Harris Act. This is a broad state law that allows private landowners to sue government agencies for compensation when those agencies take some sort of action that basically limits the property owners' ability to monetize their land. The Burt Harris law is one that lots of large landowners in Florida use as leverage, particularly over smaller, poorer governments. So just as one example, Mosaic, the giant phosphate mining and fertilizer manufacturing company, once filed a more than $600 million lawsuit against this tiny rural county in the southern half of the state after county commissioners there refused to rezone some property Mosaic owned to allow the company to open a new strip mine for phosphate rock. It seems to me this Burt Harris claim is a pretty good sign that Ryan is trying to pressure the city into settling this lawsuit in some form that would allow this ethanol plant to go forward. And of course, even if that doesn't work and the trial actually happens and Fernandina Beach wins, we can all probably expect that Ryan will go running back to the Florida legislature next year with something very much like what it tried to do this year. Tallahassee is, after all, nothing if not a safe space for Goliaths. But, if it does show back up, we'll do our best to track it and call it out and make sure everybody knows. And every single member of the Florida legislature that decides to vote on this will be voting eyes wide open on it. So, all right, I think we'll leave it there. Another quick reminder, please click like and subscribe. And if you found the show interesting, leave a comment or a review. And as also another reminder to sign up for a subscription if you haven't already. The easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Again, subscriptions are free, but there is that option to voluntarily pay for one if you can afford it. So we will be back again with even more stories out of these records soon. There's lots of interesting stuff in this. I've joked before that filing public records requests after a legislative session is a little like a second Christmas for me, because I'm just that much of a nerd on this sort of thing. So anyway, until the next show, take care.